My name is Isabel. I'm 32 years old single, and I've lived most of my adult life doing what I thought was right, even when it wasn't easy. For the last several years, I put my own life on hold to care for my father. After my mom died, he went quiet. Not just sad, he unraveled. I had a job offer overseas at the time and a man I thought I might marry. But I stayed. I moved back into my childhood home to help him through his grief. I handled the bills, the appointments, the funeral, the estate. I cooked for him, organized his medications, and got him walking again when he stopped leaving the house. I didn't complain. I didn't expect thanks. I just wanted him to be okay. 2 years ago, he met someone, Edward, a retired architect, charming in public, cold in private. They got married last year. I smiled for the wedding photos. I didn't mean to hold my breath around him, but I did. Still, I tried. This trip to Italy was meant to be a new chapter. I came up with the idea after seeing how much they both loved history and wine. I thought we could take a family trip, me, my dad, and Edward, just the three of us. 10 days. Florence, Siena, Rome. I offered to organize everything. And I did. I booked flights, reserved rooms, put together a shared itinerary on Google Drive. I printed walking maps and made dinner reservations. I even made custom luggage tags. And then 6 days before departure, I got the text. You are not joining us. Edward thinks it's better to keep this a family-only trip. That was it. No greeting, no explanation. I stared at the screen. My phone sat in the palm of my hand like it had betrayed me too. Family only. The word stung deeper than I expected. I was his daughter, his only child. I had put off graduate school. I'd turned down love. I'd missed job opportunities. Also, he wouldn't be alone. And now I wasn't considered family. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, half packing a small suitcase. A linen blouse draped across my lap. My passport lay on the dresser next to a slim red guidebook I'd bought last week. I didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, I typed one word. Okay, I didn't ask why. I didn't plead. I knew better than to argue when someone had already decided you didn't matter. Then I stood up, folded the blouse, zipped the suitcase closed, even though I no longer needed it. It was strange how quickly the room felt foreign, like all the plans I had made had belonged to someone else. I wandered to the kitchen, still holding my phone, still staring at the message. I poured myself a glass of water I didn't drink. The clock ticked on the wall. The dishwasher hummed. I was no longer part of the trip. I was no longer part of the picture. I sat down in the quiet and let the silence answer for me. There was a time when my father couldn't get out of bed on his own. It started the morning after the funeral. He sat in the living room in his old robe, staring at the cold cup of coffee I had made for him. I remember how small he looked that day, like the world had shrunk around him, and he hadn't yet figured out how to move inside it. I was 27. I had just finished a contract with a publishing firm in Seattle. I had interviews lined up in London, maybe even a teaching fellowship. Instead, I canceled everything and flew back to Connecticut. The house was too quiet without my mother. It smelled like old tea and unopened mail. I unpacked my suitcase in my childhood bedroom and told myself it would be temporary, just until Dad found his feet again. He didn't. I stayed. At first, it was small things: grocery lists, refilling prescriptions, handling the insurance paperwork. Then it became full-time, setting reminders for his doctor visits, scheduling the plumber, figuring out property taxes. Grief changes people, I knew that, but I didn't expect him to disappear into it so completely. Some mornings he wouldn't speak at all. I'd leave toast on a plate, a note by the sink, and just hope the food would be gone by lunchtime. I paid the electric bill. I filed his taxes. I made sure the refrigerator wasn't empty. People at church would say, "You're such a good daughter." They didn't see the nights I sat alone at the dining table staring at spreadsheets of bills I wasn't sure I could afford. I was working part-time at a local bookstore. Quiet job, no benefits, but flexible hours. It allowed me to run home when he had bad days, when he locked himself in the garage or forgot what month it was. My mother had always said he was a strong man, and he was. But strength looks different when it's held up by someone else's hands. The first time he laughed again was a full year later. I remember it because I wrote it down in a notebook. He'd spilled juice on his pants and muttered, "Your mother would have said I look like a toddler." Then he chuckled. I hadn't heard that sound in 12 months. I excused myself and cried in the laundry room. There was a quiet joy in helping him come back to life, in seeing him mow the lawn again, in hearing him hum to old Sinatra records. I thought maybe this was enough. And then Edward showed up. He was polite at first, reserved. He brought my father coffee from that expensive cafe near the post office and talked about real estate. I wasn't sure how to feel. I wanted Dad to have companionship, yes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Edward studied people the same way he studied blueprints, calculating value, measuring what could be renovated and what needed to be removed. Within a few months, they were dating. My father was happy. I didn't want to question that. But slowly things began to shift. Decisions that used to include me suddenly didn't. Conversations were held behind closed doors. Edward began referring to my father's house as ours, even though the deed still listed my father alone. When they announced they were getting married, I offered to help. They said they had it handled. I wasn't asked to speak at the ceremony. I wasn't even in the wedding photos. At the reception, a relative of Edward's leaned over and asked if I was just a friend of the family. I laughed it off, but the truth sat like a rock in my stomach. I went home that night and cleaned the kitchen until 2 a.m. Even after they moved in together, I stayed around. Not in the house, but nearby, 10 minutes away, in a rental I could barely afford. Dad still needed rides to appointments. He still called me when the thermostat confused him. He still handed me forms from the mail saying I never understand these. And I still helped, because I thought that's what daughters did. Now, sitting in my apartment days before their big family trip to Italy, I realized something else. Some people don't forget what you've done for them, but others, they remember just long enough to replace you. After the text, things fell into place in a way I wish they hadn't. I started noticing what I had missed, or maybe refused to see. There were signs long before the message. Quiet, polite signals that I was no longer inside the circle, just orbiting around it. I had been removed from the shared family calendar a few weeks ago. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I even emailed my dad to ask, "Did you change the settings?" He never replied. Then there was the group chat for travel planning. I'd been the one to start it. I added hotel links reminders, museum ticket options. At some point, they created a new chat without me. I only found out because Edward accidentally mentioned a restaurant reservation I hadn't seen. "We discussed it on the family thread," he said with a shrug. "What thread?" I asked. "Oh," he said, pausing just long enough to let the truth show, "maybe you weren't added to that one." I told myself it didn't matter, but it did. On paper, we were still family. In practice, I had been quietly replaced. I remember the moment it became real. I was dropping off a scarf I had hand-sewn for my dad. He used to love soft cotton, hated tight collars. I had stitched his initials in one corner, like Mom used to do. Edward opened the door, leaned against the frame, and said, "You don't have to do things like this anymore, Isabel. We're taking care of each other now." He smiled when he said it. Not cruelly, not sharply. Just a clean little slice of dismissal dressed as kindness. And my father, he stood behind him in the hallway, silent, pretending to read a brochure about Tuscany. I handed the scarf to Edward and walked away. That was 3 weeks before the trip. Now, sitting in my apartment with nothing to pack for, I kept thinking about all the versions of family I'd tried to protect. There were dinners I cooked when Edward said he was too tired after long business calls. There were times I helped clean the guest room before Edward's sons came to visit, even though none of them ever learned my name. There were holidays where I brought desserts no one touched, birthdays where I gave thoughtful gifts and received nothing but nods. I had become invisible in plain sight. They called themselves a family now, a unit. I was no longer part of that equation. I saw a post online a few days later, a photo of my dad and Edward holding wine glasses on the deck behind the house. The caption read, "Countdown to Italy with the man I love and our beautiful blended family." The only people in the photo were Edward, my father, and Edward's 2 adult sons. No one mentioned me. I reread that caption more times than I should have. Not because I was confused, but because I was trying to find a version of myself in it. There wasn't one. A few days later, I stopped by the pharmacy to pick up a prescription for my dad, one I had refilled on his behalf every month for 3 years. The clerk said, "Oh, Edward came in yesterday. He said you wouldn't be handling this anymore." I smiled and nodded, even though something cold tightened in my chest. I was being written out, quietly, efficiently, not because I did something wrong, but because I reminded them of what they wanted to forget: grief, history, obligation. I wasn't shiny or new. I wasn't part of Edward's vision. I didn't fit the lifestyle they were building one of dinner parties, charity galas, curated social media photos. I didn't photograph well in that world, so they erased me. And I let them for longer than I care to admit. But the thing about being pushed out is eventually you find yourself standing in a space you didn't ask for. But now that you're there, you can finally see things clearly. They had pushed me out of their family, but they had also pushed me into something else. A place where I could finally ask, what do I want to do with this silence? And maybe more importantly, what do I still have control over? A few days after the Italy trip began, I stopped checking my phone for updates. No more photos from Edward's feed. No more checking my father's WhatsApp status to see if he was online. I had seen enough. I didn't want to know what wines they were drinking in Tuscany, or which ancient cathedral they were touring without me. I didn't want to see Edward's sons grinning in front of places I had researched and recommended. Instead, I did something else. I pulled out a file box labeled Legal, Mom. It had sat in the back of my hallway closet for years. I hadn't opened it since the year after she died. Inside were papers I hadn't thought much about at the time, copies of her will insurance documents, medical records. But as I flipped through the folders, I came across a beige envelope. My name was written on the front in her handwriting. I paused. I wasn't sure I was ready for what was inside, but I opened it anyway. It contained a letter. Not long. A page and a half. She had written it about 2 months before her death. I read the last line first. "I trust you to protect what matters." It took me a few minutes before I could start from the beginning. In the letter, she thanked me for staying, for being strong, for not letting my father fall apart. She wrote that she had always seen how much I gave even when no one else did. And then she explained something I had forgotten. Before she died, she had moved a portion of her savings along with her share of the house into a separate trust, one that listed me as a co-owner and legal beneficiary. She hadn't told my father. "I know he loves you," she wrote, "but he will listen to other voices one day. This is for your protection." I sat there for a long time, the letter on my lap, the trust documents underneath. I felt two things at once, grief and something sharper underneath. Not anger, not yet. Clarity. I remembered signing some of the paperwork after the funeral. The attorney had explained that my mother's share of the house would pass through a living trust. I hadn't thought much of it then. I assumed everything stayed with Dad. I never imagined I might own any part of the house. But here it was in print. Her portion of the home was mine, legally and fully. I called the law office the next morning. The firm had changed names, but the partner who handled my mother's estate still worked there. He remembered me. After a few hours of email exchanges and document scanning, he confirmed that I held 48% ownership of the property. The trust had never been modified. Technically, I had equal say in any sale, rental, or legal claim regarding the house. Technically, it was not entirely theirs. And then something else surfaced. I checked the old travel folder I had made on my laptop. Back when I was still organizing the Italy trip, I had used my personal credit card to secure the group hotel booking. I had requested reimbursement from Dad afterward, but he never followed up and I never pushed. The confirmation emails were still there. The reservations had been made in my name. I was the primary booking contact. The hotel had simply added the other guests later. It wasn't about the money anymore, but it was about the pattern. My hands had built the things they now enjoyed this trip, that housed this family, and I had been edited out of the photo. I stared at my laptop, then at the letter from Mom. "You don't have to stay invisible." Her words came back to me in waves. Maybe I didn't want revenge, but I wanted space, my own. And if I couldn't have love or gratitude, I would at least have clarity. I sat quietly at my desk, opened a blank document, and began drafting a plan. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. Because sometimes the only way to reclaim what you gave away is to stop asking for permission. It started with a phone call. The attorney who had helped manage my mother's estate, Mr. Callahan, had a calm, deliberate voice. He listened without interrupting as I explained everything: the house, the trust, the Italy trip, the silence. I didn't cry. I spoke plainly, like someone reading instructions from a manual she never asked to write. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then he said, "You're well within your rights to take action, Isabel." "I don't want a war," I said. "I just want to stop being erased." "I understand," he replied. "That's a different kind of justice." He walked me through the steps. Legally, I owned nearly half the house. If I chose to sell or transfer my share, my father and Edward would be required to either match the value or agree to a co-ownership resolution. If they refused, I could force a sale. The law was dry, but the implications were not. I wasn't just a name on paper. I was a decision maker. I had power, and I was going to use it. The next day, I drafted a formal letter of intent to sell my portion of the property. Not to just anyone, but to a real estate group in town I knew had interest in that neighborhood. The offer was fair, competitive even. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I was just done waiting to be acknowledged. The agency responded quickly. They had a client ready to move. I scheduled an inspection and gave access through the side gate. My father and Edward wouldn't be back for 3 more days. I also contacted the hotel in Florence where they were staying. I didn't mention who I was. I simply called to confirm the name on the reservation mine. It was still listed under my profile. I requested that all bookings under that confirmation number be canceled. They complied. I didn't ask for a refund. I just wanted the thread cut. By the end of the week, the paperwork to sell my share of the house was moving. Quietly, legally, without drama. I felt something strange as I walked back to my car from the notary office. Relief, not triumph, not bitterness. Just a small, unfamiliar calmness in my chest. This wasn't vengeance. It was release. For so long, I had been the invisible backbone in other people's stories. Now I was writing one of my own, and I wasn't going to wait for anyone's approval to finish it. That night, I walked past the house, their house, my house. It looked smaller than I remembered. The porch light was off. The curtains were drawn. A neighbor's sprinkler ticked in the distance. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. I stood at the sidewalk and let the wind move through my hair. I had spent years stepping around everyone else's comfort, tiptoeing through other people's boundaries while mine were ignored. And for what? So I could be left out of a family vacation. So I could be thanked with silence. No, I may not have been invited. But I hadn't been defeated. And when they came home, they would find out, not in a fight, not in a messy argument. They would find out in signatures, in revised deeds, in ownership transfers, in certified letters sent to their door. They would return from Florence thinking everything was exactly as they left it, and they would be wrong. I didn't want them to be ruined. I just wanted them to feel the absence they had created, to feel for once what it's like to be the one standing outside the door. That night I slept through without waking up once. No dreams, no questions, just rest. They came home on a Wednesday afternoon. I knew because the motion sensor camera on the front porch sent me a silent notification. I had never removed myself from the security system. I suppose they'd assumed I had. People often forget who really set things up in the first place. I didn't rush to watch the footage. I waited until the evening when the sun had dipped below the horizon and my apartment was quiet. When I finally opened the app, I saw them step onto the porch, dragging matching silver suitcases behind them. My father looked tired, a little thinner than I remembered, his skin pale from too much wine and too little sleep. Edward, by contrast, seemed alert and sharp, his shirt still pressed from the flight. He tried the door. It didn't open. He tried again. Then my father stepped forward and pulled out his key. Still didn't work. I had already changed the locks. The next clip showed Edward pulling out his phone, tapping quickly. I didn't answer. Instead, I watched them pace. Edward called someone, probably a locksmith, but he would quickly find out that the house was no longer just theirs to enter. My phone rang less than an hour later. My father's name lit up the screen. I stared at it for a long moment before answering. "Isabel," he said, his voice heavy. "What's going on?" "You came back earlier than I expected," I said calmly. "We can't get in the house," he said. "The locks are changed. The neighbor said there was a for sale sign here while we were gone." "There was." "What is this?" Edward's voice cut in. He had taken the phone. "This is illegal." "It's not," I replied. "I sold my share of the house. A legal transaction, fully documented. You'll find a packet waiting for you in the mailbox, or with your attorney if you prefer." My father took the phone back. "You could have talked to me. You could have invited me," I said. There was a long silence. He tried again. "You've always been part of this family." "No," I said. "You just told yourself that while you erased me in the background." But I was the one who stayed. I was the one who picked up the pieces after Mom died. And you let someone new walk in and decide that I didn't belong. You don't understand. Edward just thought I don't care what Edward thought I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. And the worst part is, neither did you. Another silence. This one, longer. He was listening, but it was too late for listening. I ended the call before he could say anything else. The next day, I received a formal notice from their attorney, a challenge to the transaction. Mr. Callahan handled the response. Calm, efficient, unbothered. The paperwork held up. The trust was valid. The sale was complete. The buyers were already preparing to move in. My father and Edward had 60 days to vacate or buy out the remainder of the property at market rate. They couldn't afford it. I knew that. Not unless Edward sold one of his properties, and that wasn't going to happen. The house had been the only home I'd ever known. But I didn't miss it. What I missed was the version of my father who used to leave coffee on the porch when I had a hard night, the man who used to hum when he cooked breakfast, who held my hand at my mother's burial when I nearly collapsed. That man didn't text me that I was no longer family. That man didn't choose comfort over connection. I didn't return to the house again. I didn't want to. But I did hear through a mutual acquaintance that Edward was furious, that he blamed me, that he called me unstable, disrespectful, cold. Maybe I was. Maybe cold is what you become after standing outside long enough. I let the storm pass. I kept my head down. I signed the final documents, wired the closing paperwork, and made one last phone call to the buyers, a young couple expecting their first child. They loved the house, the front porch, the neighborhood, everything about it. I didn't tell them it used to be mine. That part didn't matter anymore. A week later, I received a letter, handwritten, from my father. It was only 2 sentences long. "I'm sorry for how things turned out. I hope one day you'll forgive me." I folded the letter carefully and put it in the same envelope where I had stored my mother's. Then I closed the box, stood up, and opened the windows to let in the spring air. It smelled like cut grass and new beginnings. I moved 3 weeks later. It wasn't dramatic, no tearful goodbyes or big declarations. I just packed up my one-bedroom apartment, loaded the boxes into a rented van, and drove 2 hours north to a town by the coast I had always loved, but never had the time or freedom to live in. There was a small cottage for rent near the edge of the water. Nothing fancy. 1 bedroom, a screened-in porch, a sloping roof that creaked when it rained. But it had sunlight and silence, and enough space for a garden if I ever felt like planting one. The first morning, I woke up to birds instead of traffic. I made my own coffee, walked barefoot to the porch, and sat down in the old rocking chair that came with the place. It was chipped and worn, but solid. I held the warm mug between my palms and just breathed. I didn't check my phone. I didn't look at social media. I didn't wonder where my father and Edward were now living. I didn't care if they were angry, confused, or trying to rewrite the story. That chapter was closed. For years, I had tried to earn my place in a family that only saw me when I was useful. I had cooked, cleaned, canceled plans, swallowed disappointment, and smiled through silence. I had waited for someone to say, You matter. You belong. They never did. So I said it to myself. I mattered. I belonged to me. Later that week, I visited a local shelter and adopted a dog. His name was Murphy. He was 6 years old, part retriever, part who knows what, a little scruffy, a little cautious, just like me. He took to me immediately, followed me from room to room, always a few steps behind, never too close. It took him 2 days to fall asleep beside my feet, and 3 more before he let out a sigh in the middle of the night and rested his head on my arm. I called it trust, the slow, patient kind. I found part-time work at the town library, nothing grand. A few shifts a week helping seniors with their devices shelving, returned books recommending mysteries and romance novels to retirees who became quick friends. I started writing again, just a little. Short essays, thoughts, things I never had time to say when I was busy explaining myself to people who never really listened. One afternoon, I wrote something I almost posted online. Family doesn't always look like a table full of smiling faces. Sometimes it's just you, a dog at your feet, and a cup of coffee you made for yourself. And that's enough. I didn't post it. I kept it for myself. It wasn't bitterness that filled me. It was something else, something softer, peace. Every now and then, someone from my old town would message me, "Did you really sell the house? What happened with your dad?" Was it true I didn't answer most of them? The ones who mattered already knew. One day a letter arrived. Not from my father this time, but from one of Edward's sons. The middle one, Daniel, I think. It was a single sheet of paper. "I didn't understand what you were going through. I'm sorry we didn't treat you better." I folded the letter and added it to the others. A small reminder that sometimes people do change. But I didn't wait for it. I had already moved on. I took Murphy for long walks. I learned how to cook for pleasure, not just responsibility. I planted lavender outside the kitchen window. I made friends with the widow 2 doors down who brought me zucchini bread and asked if I liked crossword puzzles. I didn't fix everything. I didn't become some glowing version of success. But I became myself again. And maybe for the first time, I learned how to stay. Not for anyone else. Not for duty. Not for family. Just for me. Because sometimes the people you love most will ask you to disappear so they can stay comfortable. And if you let them, they will forget you ever carried them. But if you step away quietly, steadily, they will feel the shift. And you will feel free.